right? You have a difficulty in access to public goods and services, right? You have governments that are struggling to provide public goods and services, to provide structures for the citizens. You have people who are, falling backwards, right, in terms of, say, poverty, for example, right? Prior to the pandemic, you had this issue where World Bank had, indicated that they were on track, right, to address poverty issues globally, right about 2030, around that period. And since the pandemic, right, this has actually reversed. We have about 250 million people who have been pushed back to the brink of of poverty all over again. See, so the human angle, the human dimension, right, I think is something that you should pay attention to. It is either you could get it as a specific question. I don't know. I'm just suggesting, right? You could get it as a specific question, or you could get a question that asks you, right? What are the various international organizations that place an emphasis, right, on the idea of critical development, on the idea of development, on the idea of making improvements to people's lives? That would be a very novel angle that they could test you on in this course. Keep in mind, right, that with the exams being online, right? I think I told you all this last week, right? We had a meeting, but for a different program. But they have been already considering. I don't know whether I told this class or not. They've been already considering, right, that they want to make the questions a bit more application style. Oh, very cool. They want to make the questions a bit more application style, right? Okay. So they could be thinking of newer types of questions to test you on. And if you look at, some of the past year papers, right, you do see, questions that have been like, recycled, or very similar questions that are coming out. I feel that this is something to pay attention to. Even if they don't test you on that per se, even if they ask you a question, right, that is on the evaluation of international organizations, right, in terms of contribution, right? What is the contribution of, particular types of organizations? What is the contribution, right, of, international organizations to human development? Or just what's the contribution of the organization itself? You could craft an angle in the answer to say, okay, we have international organizations that contribute to the stability of the international financial regime. You have, and then you refer to IMF and World Bank, for instance, right? Or in your evaluation of that, you have organizations that contribute to the international legal regime, where you would refer to ICC, right? ICTY, ICTR. Organizations that contribute to the human dimension, or the human political dimension, right? However you want to phrase it. So you could actually use this as a theme, right, to discuss the contribution and the evaluation of international organizations. Do you believe that organizations are pathological in nature, right, in the current era? No, I don't believe so, because there are organizations that have made very relevant contributions. OSCE is one of them, and use it as an example. Do you understand the rationale? How to utilize, right? That means the logic is this, right? You don't take, the organization and chuck it aside because you say, oh, past year exam papers, they have not tested on this organization before. Therefore, it is not relevant. Where can you use it to enhance your answer? You understand? And use it in terms of themes, right? I've told you before, right? The level 2 course, you cannot afford to just write a story, write a descriptive answer. You want to write answers in terms of themes. So if you're going to ever refer to any kind of organization that discusses the idea, right, of human element, discusses the idea of the human dimension, discusses the idea of development. You all know the difference? Do you all know the difference between the idea of orthodox development versus critical development? You all have come across this before, right? In like IR 1011 or something like that, right? You know the difference between the two? Orthodox development. How do you measure development in an orthodox manner? Do you remember this? It's in it's in the Bailey's textbook. You all have Bailey's textbook? Okay. Just write it down. Just write it down in your notes first. I'll explain to you now. I'll explain to you now, all right? Then you later on go back, take a look at that. I think I have a separate PDF on this explaining this, but let me explain to you now before I start the lecture so that you can keep this in mind when we are looking at this. Okay, all right. Okay, when you look at development, right, is understood traditionally in the orthodox sense. Orthodox. Okay. So when you look at development in the orthodox sense, right, what are the indicators, your traditional indicators of development? You use things like GDP, you use things like growth statistics, employment, right? Okay. These are like your numerical indicators or your financial indicators and so on. Okay. So, the most common one is, of course, GDP growth, inflation, employment, and so on. Okay. So when you use these indicators of development, can you look at a state and say, okay, it has gotten 6% GDP growth? Can you honestly say that that state has experienced, everybody in that state has experienced development and growth? Cannot, right? Because there is not necessarily a trickle-down effect that allows everybody in the state to experience that 6% growth of GDP development, correct? Okay, so when we refer to a state as being developed, right, it not necessarily encapsulates the idea that everybody is enjoying this level of development. So when they started to look at the idea of development, right, you have a bunch of theorists who say, no, we reject this notion of development. The idea of development is contested. You cannot just look at things like numerical indicators, GDP growth or employment or inflation or education levels and so on, and determine that this particular community has experienced development. So they reject this idea of orthodox development. So that's why we call it orthodox, because it's like the traditional idea of development, right? And then they came up with this framework that refers to critical development. Okay, so it's orthodox versus critical development. Okay, this is where, I think in the bit, I cannot remember specifically what chapter number it is, but I think the chapter is called development per se, right? When you look at critical development, the indicators are different. The indicators, right, are looking at whether a community experiences things like gender equality, whether they have an opportunity to participate in democratic decision-making processes, whether there's an opportunity for self-sufficiency, right? Okay. Whether there's an opportunity for things like, the advancement. Remember, we say the embellishment of society, right? Upward mobility, right? So do they have an opportunity to access education? Is there things like environmental sustainability that is being addressed? That is a better indicator of development as opposed to your traditional orthodox idea of development, right? So that takes into consideration the human element, the human dimension, right? Because if you're looking at things like democratic decision making, if you're looking at things like access to education, gender equality, or just, equity in the system, right? That is a more comprehensive, nuanced idea of what development actually is. So in that way, when you use these kinds of indicators, when you use this kind of framework to look at society, so, for example, you can even say that, based on, say, for example, access to microfinance and, crediting, learning simple ideas about how to, make calculations, right? Even communities, like, in rural areas, like, say, for example, communities of housewives in Bangladesh, for example. That's the example that is given in the Bailey's textbook, if I remember correctly. Communities of housewives in Bangladesh and in other, developing countries, where they learn how to engage in microfinancing. They buy, cattle. They engage in cottage industries. They make, toys and baskets and things like that, right? They also have an opportunity to advance, right? Right, you understand the rationale? They don't have to go to the city to work in office jobs in order to enjoy any kind of advancement or any kind of growth or development, right? According to the traditional sense. Do you understand? So that is the idea. That is why the human angle, right, becomes increasingly important, right? So I give you this idea now, right? The different indicators. Let me go back. I remember I'm very sure I pulled out a separate section. and I did craft a little discussion on critical versus orthodox development. Somebody, Vaishnavi, can you remind me? Can you send me an email and remind me to upload the thing? Huh? Okay. Okay, so you use that angle, right? Now that I give you this idea, right? So when I talk about human development, or when I refer to the idea of critical development, it's a very useful concept, right? You can use it for this cause, you can use it for other causes also. But I find that this is a very useful concept because it, talks about the idea of, the, moving away from the traditional ideas of development. What is the meaning of development? What is the meaning of advancement of, societies and so on, right? And if you're going to be talking about contribution of international organizations to the international system, how can you ignore this element as well, right? It doesn't make sense to ignore this element because you're only looking at high politics in that sense, right? The individual international organizations do make an impact on societies, right? So this is where I would, include this. And if you're talking about OSCE in particular, definitely I would want to include something along these lines. Even if you talk about, say, for example, IMF and World Bank, and when you talk about, the idea of who are the, the victims, right, or who are those who bear the burden of these economic mismanagement of the state to start off with, and then when they refer to when they refer themselves to the international organization, the IMF and World Bank, to take the loans, right? And at the end of the day, the loans refer to very deep austerity cuts, and then again the citizens are the ones who are affected, right? Then again, right, you can use this idea of the logic of critical development to say that, yeah, the state and the elites may have been able to address things like what is that, the balance of payment deficit. They maybe have been able to push levels of GDP growth, right, as a result of taking these loans and making some adjustments and austerity cuts and so on. But is the issue of critical development actually addressed, right? In terms of how does this IMF and World Bank and so on improve the lives of the citizens, right? Then you can drag in this concept of critical development as well. It's a very useful concept to think about, right? I'm not saying that you have to use it. I'm saying that if you want to add an additional angle of analysis, because the logic here is not to write a descriptive answer, it's to write an analytical answer. And when you're looking for things like themes, you're looking for IR concepts. This is a very significant IR concept that you want to consider. All right. Okay. So I'm not saying you must use it. I'm saying it is useful to include, right? Find a way, if you're going to use it, make sure, of course, you put it in the correct, part of the essay. But this is something that is useful to pay attention to. Okay. All right. Everybody clear on this one? Okay. It's in the Baylis textbook. I cannot remember who's the author, but it's I think towards the second half of the textbook. If you do not have the Baylis textbook chapter, please let me know. I will extract the chapter because I have a PDF copy. The PDF copy is available for you online also. You can find it easily. But if you need it, right, just let me know. I will extract the chapter and I'll upload it for you into the, what's that? What is this? The e-global. I want to say Google Drive. My brain is not working. That is CPU. Okay, I'll upload it for you into the e-global. Vaishnavi, please remind me to send the thing out. Okay. All right. Okay, so you understand the logic that I'm trying to explain down here. Okay, so let's look at the OSCE in particular. All right, so of course describe the OSCE, all right, and then talk about it as in terms of effectiveness as an actor in the international politics. Okay, so please, this one, can you please underline the Adler reading? Can you please do the Adler reading? I have already uploaded a whole bunch of readings for you in the e-global, right? Under not under the lecture notes, but there's another folder. All right. Can you please upload? Upload. Can you please check the PDF readings that have been uploaded for you? Please do the Adler reading. All right, because the Adler reading, like I told you, the Adler one is the one that talks about the logic of the security community. Last week's reading for NATO, where the security community was discussed, was in the McKellar reading, right? But Adler and Barnett also refer to the idea of the security community. And for OSCE, security community is even more important to make reference to. So can you please make sure that you at least skim through. I've made reference to the Adler reading in the lecture notes. All right, but can you at least skim through and take a look, especially with regards to the parts, on the security community, number one. Number two, they also make this comment about uh, NATO actually emulating the way OSCE functions, right, in terms of the security community. So please, at least that part, try to focus on that and pay attention to it. Okay, Ken? All right, it's not a difficult reading to do. It's quite simple, right? Please take a look at that one. Okay. And then whatever articles that I've given you, please take a look at it, especially I think that's the last slide. Those are the updated ones, the more recent ones, right? They are opinion articles. The one of it is a podcast. The other one, I think, is a forum, which is actually, it's quite a long video. Just sit down and watch it, right? Because it is very, very recent. I think because they recently had a meeting and they were discussing